Welcome everyone to the Winkelman lecture. This is part 1 of 2. I just want to give a few housekeeping notes in regards to your CEUs. For today's webinar, you will need to stay the duration of the time and respond to each poll. The evaluation will be sent in 2 to 3 business days to those who have met the attendance requirements. If you have any questions, please use the chat box or email the CE office following the event. I will put exactly what I just said in the chat, so if you guys have any questions, reach out to the Continuing Education Office or put a question in the chat. We will get started in just a couple moments.
Good afternoon. Welcome to our guests, Centennial Committee members, distinguished alumni, faculty, staff, students, and friends of the University of Michigan School of Social Work. Welcome to the 2021 Winkelman Lecture. This lecture is part of the school's centennial. We are celebrating the School of Social Work's 100th anniversary since its inception as a program of study in the College of Literature, Science, and Arts in Detroit at the University of Michigan in 1921. I'm delighted to tell you a little bit about the history of the Winkelman Lecture. The Leon and Josephine Winkelman Memorial Lecture was created in 1978 at the University of Michigan School of Social Work with an endowed gift from Stanely J. Winkelman and his brothers as a memorial and tribute to their parents. Stanley's father, Leon Winkelman, co-founded Winkelman Stores in Detroit in 1928 with his brother Isidore. Stanley's mother, Josephine Winkelman, was a 1919 graduate from the University of Michigan Social Work program. She worked at Hull House, Jane Addams Settlement House in Chicago, which became a model for community social work throughout the country. The Winkelman Lecture provides a forum for presenting new and emerging knowledge from the social sciences and helping professions in the field of gerontology. It is also for discussing the application of this knowledge to develop social policy, the organization and management of social welfare services, and the delivery of social work services. The Winkelman Lecture provides a forum for presenting new and emerging knowledge from the social sciences and helping professions in the field of gerontology. It also provides a forum for discussing the application of this knowledge to developing social policy, the organization and management of social welfare services, and for the delivery of social work services. Stanely J. Winkelman was a leader in civic affairs in Detroit. After the 1967 uprising sent other retailers to the suburbs, Stanley kept his family's department stores in the city, hoping that their presence could contribute to and sustain an environment suitable for doing business. Mr. Winkelman was deeply involved in social justice issues throughout the city. In 1963, as part of the Detroit Commission on Community Relations, he called upon the Detroit Board of Education to hire more Black teachers to further desegregate Detroit's teaching force. Stanley passed away in 1999, but his legacy lives on in the Detroit community and at the University of Michigan. We're very grateful to the Winkelman family for their support of this important annual event that informs our profession and provides an opportunity to honor our alumna, Josephine Winkelman and her husband, Leon. Thank you, Dr. Lisa Barnes, for participating as our keynote speaker today. Dr. Robert Taylor will be introducing Dr. Barnes. Professors Jamie Mitchell and Katrina Ellis will be panelists for part 2 of the lecture, which will be held tomorrow, February 24th. Please join us, everybody. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Robert Taylor. Robert will serve as our moderator today. Robert is the Harold R. Johnson Endowed Professor of Social Work and the Sheila Feld Collegiate Professor of Social Work at the University of Michigan. He is also director of the Program for Research on Black Americans at the Institute for Social Research at the U of M. Robert has published extensively on the informal social support networks of adult and elderly Black Americans. He is the top-ranked researcher of African American life within the field of social work. He has been principal investigator of several grants from the National Institute on Aging that examine the role of religion in the lives of Black and white elderly adults. Robert has also collaborated with the late James Jackson on several grants from the National Institute of Mental Health on the correlates of mental health and mental illness among Black Americans. This includes the only major national study of the prevalence of mental illness among Black Americans. Robert has edited 2 books, Family Life in Black America and Aging in Black America. And he's the lead author of the book, Religion in the Lives of African Americans, Social, Psychological, and Health Perspectives. Robert Taylor is the founding editor of the African American Research Perspectives and has published over 175 peer-reviewed journals. Furthermore, he's a dedicated mentor, and there are colleagues across the entire nation and indeed the world who are grateful to have the opportunity to be mentored by Dr. Taylor. I now welcome Robert Taylor, who will introduce today's keynote speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Robert Taylor, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lisa Barnes. Dr. Barnes is a professor at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. She has received numerous NIH grants and has published over 200 manuscripts. Her research interests include disparities in chronic diseases of aging, cognitive decline, and risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. She is without a doubt the leading scholar in the country on cognitive decline among African Americans. One of her major claims and major accomplishments is that she received her PhD from the University of Michigan. Anytime a student asks me about research on African Americans and Alzheimer's, I always first send them straight to Dr. Barnes's research. So please welcome Dr. Lisa Barnes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Just 1 second here. Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for this opportunity to join this really important lecture series. I want to first start off by thanking the Winkelman family for establishing and supporting this lecture series since I think I heard 1978, which is amazing. I also want to thank Drs. Taylor and Vedeka for the invitation to serve as a keynote speaker this year, to be a part of your 100th anniversary, which is really exciting. Before I get started, I want to find out who we have in the audience, who who am I talking to? So can you please indicate whether you are a graduate student, a professor, practicing clinician, or other? I'll give you a few seconds to click your answer. Okay. Oh, wow. Okay, we have a very diverse group. 42% other, so I'm assuming that might be alum and Friends of Michigan. 40% practicing clinician. We have professors, and we don't have that many students, surprisingly. Okay, well, I'm happy to have all of you here today. So I study one of the most feared diseases of old age, Alzheimer's. It's feared by everyone, but my research focuses on older African Americans, and what I will spend my time on today is the problem of Alzheimer's in African Americans, and I will describe some of our data where we've tried to understand racial differences in cognitive aging, and then I will go on to highlight a few risks and protective factors for the disease in this population. To understand the problem, however, we first need to have a little bit of context. There are currently a little over 5 million people in the US with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, probably a gross underestimate. And this number is projected to increase to more than 14 million by 2050, or by 2060, sorry, unless we find a cure or a way to prevent the disease. At the same time, the demographic profile of our older adult population is rapidly changing. So the slide on the right, I'll get my laser pointer, shows the distribution of the US population over age 65 by race and ethnicity from 2012 to 2040. And what you can see is that in 2012, the diverse population made up about 21% of the older adult population. And by 2040, that percentage is going to go up to about 35%, with the older white population actually decreasing by more than 10 percentage points. These two trends together, a growing number of Alzheimer's cases and an increasingly diverse older population, will present an increasingly burdensome problem for African Americans and their families in particular, because a growing body of evidence suggests that African Americans are about 2 times more likely than whites to have Alzheimer's dementia. It's also been documented that they are less likely to receive a formal diagnosis, and when they do, it's often at the very severe stages. They're also under-included in Alzheimer's clinical trials. So this condition represents a real disparity for African Americans. Here are age-adjusted dementia incidence rates by race and ethnicity to illustrate the disparity. These data come from over 270,000 healthcare members of Kaiser on the West Coast. And as you can see, shown here in this gray bar, dementia incidence rates are highest in African Americans than any other racial ethnic group. Given this disparity and the fact that there are no therapies to change the course of the disease, prevention becomes an important action area. At Rush, we conduct large longitudinal epidemiologic cohort studies to identify risk factors that lead to Alzheimer's disease. We try to determine the biologic pathways linking these risk factors to disease so that we and others may develop strategies to prevent Alzheimer's and reduce disparities, either by modifying lifestyle behaviors or identifying druggable targets and developing effective therapeutics. So how do we do this with African Americans? Well, we need large studies that include people without dementia who come from the community, not those who are recruited from a memory clinic. And at the end of the presentation, I'll show you some data as to why this is an important distinction. We also need people who will agree to annual memory testing, who will agree to interviews so that we can ascertain risk factors, with questions about behaviors, feelings, and attitudes. We also need people who will donate blood for genetic testing and also donate their brain at the time of death. So in our studies, we follow the traditional longitudinal cohort design with autopsy built in, where we enroll people at the beginning of the study who don't have any disease, so they can't have a diagnosis of dementia or be taking medications for dementia. And at baseline, we document a wide range of risk factors, and then we follow people over time, measuring their memory and thinking skills every year. And so with this design, we are able to relate the risk factors that we measured at the beginning with change in cognitive function, with incident disease, because some people will develop Alzheimer's, some will develop mild cognitive impairment, and we can relate the risk factors to the pathology that we measure in their brain at the time of death, so that we can understand the neurobiologic pathways linking risk factors to the clinical phenotypes that we're interested in. So with this design in mind, we created the Minority Aging Research Study, known as MARS, to identify and understand risk factors that might be particularly relevant to the lived experience of older African Americans. So MARS started in August of 2004, and at that time was just about 350 people in the study. Today, we have about 800 African Americans, so it's an ongoing rolling admission. People are constantly, being recruited and entering the study. The only entry criteria are that you have to be at least 65 years of age, self-identify as African American, and not have known dementia. We recruit from the community, including churches, senior buildings, and organizations and clubs that cater to older African Americans. And all participants agree to annual in-home cognitive testing. We never have people come to the medical center. We send out a team to their homes to do the testing, where we measure a range of risk factors. We take blood draw. Our follow-up rate has been really, really good. We have over 90% of surviving participants are still in the study. And I was just refunded to continue the cohort for years 16 to 20. Over time, about 10% have developed dementia, because everyone started without dementia at the beginning. And because Alzheimer's disease is really a disease of the brain, and we have to be able to measure the abnormal proteins in the brain, we started to recruit for autopsy in 2011. And this was groundbreaking because, there are very few studies that have brain tissue from older African Americans. And so we have a little bit over 100 brains to date, and we are continuing to work with families to honor the participants' wishes to get their brain at the time of death, so that we can continue to contribute to this scientific endeavor. The study is grounded in community-centered recruitment and retention, because we know that with these types of studies, especially with diverse populations where there's deep phenotyping and brain autopsy in particular, it requires significant relationship building and giving first before we ask anything of the participants. So, myself as the principal investigator, other investigators on the team, as well as staff, we're always in the community giving, not only recruitment presentations, but retention presentations where we report back to the community what we're finding. We get their input about what's important to ask and what kinds of questions are important to them, so that it's really a mutually beneficial relationship that I think has been really helpful for the study. And then, keeping in line with the spirit of giving first, I wanted to share one of the innovations of the study, given that I'm talking to School of Social Work. We have been able to incorporate social work into our studies. And the reward has been something that I had not imagined. There was a lot in the literature about the challenges of recruiting diverse populations into clinical dementia studies, but few studies had documented the effort required for studies that involve brain donation among diverse elders without dementia. There were studies of diverse elders with dementia coming from memory clinics, but very few were coming from the community without dementia. And so over time, as we were following people, some for over a decade, we were learning that in order to retain people and keep them engaged over time, we had to respond to concerns and requests from participants. And these concerns had nothing to do with research. Research was not a priority, in many people's lives. And so, we needed to be able to address critical issues in their lived experience as minority elders. And, we found that incorporating social work and really having this multidisciplinary approach has been one of the most valuable experiences of the study. And in this slide, I'm just showing you how we've had to pivot during COVID to address emerging needs like nutrition services. And, because of the amount of social isolation due to the pandemic, we've had to do more around respite and companionship. And so it's really, these services and resources, they were not as common before the pandemic. We were doing more things about, education about autopsy and, linking people to medical services, and it really shows that, without social work, we might not have been as equipped to handle this pivot and, and really keep people engaged in the study during, something that's so devastating like a pandemic. So I just really wanted to share that with, with this group in particular. So, the current cohort is about 800 African Americans currently. It's predominantly women because women are the ones who volunteer for these types of things. They're highly educated, and we've had a little bit over 200 deaths. And of those who are alive and active, a little more than half have agreed to give their brain at the time of death, which is amazing for a study like this. Now, Mars is intentionally all African American so that we can understand within race heterogeneity. However, there are research questions that require a race comparison. And for those questions, we have the availability of 2 other ongoing cohort studies at Rush, the Religious Order Study and the Rush Memory and Aging Project that have been going on for more than 20 years. And they consist of more than 3,000 people, predominantly white. They also all agree to annual detailed clinical evaluation with risk factors and blood draw. But the key difference between those studies and mine is that you have to agree to organ donation to be in those studies. So that's a condition of entry, which, I could never do that in a diverse population. I wouldn't have a single person. And so because of that, they have over 1,200 autopsies. And importantly, there's significant overlap in risk factors between those 2 studies and Mars, and we all use the same cognitive test battery. So most of what we know about racial differences in cognitive aging comes from cross-sectional studies. And in these studies, it's well documented that older racial and ethnic minorities tend to perform at lower levels on cognitive function tests than older non-Hispanic whites. Here I'm showing you a couple examples of this finding. On this side of the slide are data from two studies, MIDAS and YCAP, two really famous studies. The details aren't important, but what it shows is performance on two different cognitive tests, episodic memory and executive function. And what you can see is that, no matter what the age, African Americans are, on the bottom, are performing at lower levels than age-matched whites. We see the same pattern in a study from HRS, the Health and Retirement Study. Here we're showing African Americans, Hispanics, and whites, and the prevalence of cognitive impairment. And what you can see is that African Americans have a higher rate, they're the ones in blue, a higher rate of cognitive impairment at different ages, regardless of where you start the study. But we know that cognitive function is influenced by multiple cultural and social attributes outside of cognition itself. And many of these factors are also associated with race and ethnicity, including some of the factors listed here in this diagram. And this makes it challenging to interpret Black-white differences, especially when you don't adjust for these factors. And often, even when you do adjust, you still see differences because there are likely other factors that differ between African Americans and whites that we're either not measuring or not capturing well in our studies. And so if we're interested in understanding racial differences in aging, and aging is fundamentally a process of change over time, we need to complement these cross-sectional studies with longitudinal studies where people are followed over time so that we can see how trajectories might differ as a function of race. And so when we do this, we see that there is a huge, wide variability in how people age. Here I'm showing you a random plot of African Americans and whites from our studies. The whites are shown in the red lines and the African Americans are in the black lines. And this is the measure of cognitive test performance. So higher scores are better, negative scores are worse. And what you can see is that there's some people who start out and they decline pretty rapidly. Others seem to get a little bit better. Some kind of just coast along. You really have a lot of heterogeneity in aging trajectory. But when you average out these trajectories with mixed effects models, you get a clearer picture of how people are changing over time. So to orient you to this graph, each line represents a 5-year path of change with people starting the study at different ages. Cognitive function is plotted on this axis. So we have semantic memory tests, and we have perceptual speed tests. And so higher scores are better performance, and lower scores are worse performance. Whites are shown on top in the green, and African Americans are the blue lines on the bottom. And what you can see is that whites start out at higher levels compared to African Americans, but the slopes of the lines are parallel over time, except for out here at the oldest ages, where it looks like African Americans might be declining a little bit slower. So you get this pattern where you see these differences in level, but not in change over time. We have replicated this finding in another population-based study called the Chicago Health and Aging Project. This is a project of over 10,000 African Americans and whites. It's about 60% African American. And you see the same thing. You see, here's our performance on our cognitive measure. Higher scores are better, negative scores are worse. You see that whites at every age are starting out higher compared to blacks, but the lines are parallel. They are not changing any differently over time. So our poll number 2, this is a test. Please answer true or false. African Americans have lower performance on cognitive function tests in cross-sectional studies, but few racial differences in cognitive test performance are seen in longitudinal studies. Please submit your answer. I'm gonna go on. It's like it's taking a while to get that answer. So hopefully you all answered the correct answer, which is true. In African Americans, yep, 70% got true, good. Consistent with the well-documented finding from cross-sectional studies, African Americans are performing worse on average on tests of cognition. But when you follow people over time, the data, at least in our hands, from both our volunteer cohorts as well as our population-based study of over 10,000 people, we don't see any evidence of faster rates of decline for African Americans. And if you think about it, there's this this idea that Alzheimer's is much more prevalent or is much more frequent in African Americans, and so our longitudinal data don't really line up with that finding that it's much more prevalent. So that leads us to ask different types of questions, right? So Alzheimer's is obviously still an important chronic condition of old age and a serious burden to our diverse communities. So the question becomes, can we identify risk factors that are important in the cognitive aging of older African Americans? And can we understand why there are these persistent level differences in performance between African Americans and whites? Now, in the field, there are a number of established risk factors that either increase your risk of the disease or decrease your risk. I'm not going to go into any of these in detail. I'll just say that age is the number one, the most robust risk factor for Alzheimer's. As you get older, your risk is going to increase. Something about aging that's increasing your risk. Now, most of these are non-modifiable. You can't do anything to change them. But we have published a number of other potentially modifiable factors that appear to be important in this disease. Some that increase your risk, listed in this row, this column, and some that decrease your risk. But my interest has been in understanding how these risk factors operate across race. And so we found that, many of the risk factors that we're interested in, some of the traditional risk factors, they appear to operate the same in Blacks and whites. So there are some that decrease your risk, whether you're Black or white, and there are others that increase your risk. Similarly, we found that there are some risk factors that look like they're operating differently across race. So there are some that only seem to decrease your risk in whites, and there are others that only seem to increase your risk in whites. And, we've tried to understand these patterns, and we've published several papers, but what I want to focus on today is really, the sort of the unique information that we might be able to get from the lived experience of older African Americans to see whether or not these factors may play a role in cognitive aging and risk of disease. So in my remaining time, I'm going to quickly run through a few of these listed on this slide, the ones in green in particular, to give you a sense of what we're finding in this space. So I know that, we're all probably aware of the Great Migration, where from about 1916 to 1970, about 6 million Black Southerners relocated to urban areas in the North and West as they were fleeing the Jim Crow South. And, everyone, landed in Chicago in my study, right? So either they were born in Chicago or they moved to Chicago at some point. And we found that just asking a simple question about where were you born and where were you living during your primary educational years, we find the following pattern of results. So early life residence, we find, is associated with cognitive test performance. So here is your performance on this axis. Again, higher scores are better, negative scores are worse. And we find that those African Americans who reported being born in the South or living in the South at age 12 perform more poorly on our memory and thinking tests than those born in the North or living in the North at age 12. Now, this could be due to a number of factors that differ between the South and the North, right? There's so many differences between these two geographic regions. One factor that we are curious about was school experience. So we asked people about their experience attending a legally segregated school in early life, because remember, our participants are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. So they would have been in school in, the 1920s, up until right after Brown versus Board of Education. And we have them in our study, and we are, measuring their thinking skills cross-sectionally and watching how they change over time. And so in our questions, we asked, did you attend a legally segregated school? And if so, for how many years? Now, we didn't find a main effect of segregation experience on cognition, but we did find an interesting interaction such that those born in the South who attended a legally desegregated school, here in this box, performed worse than any of the other groups, including those who were also born in the South attending a legally segregated school. Now, at first we were surprised by this finding because, there's, lots of literature to say that, the segregated schools had fewer resources, and, and there's arguments about whether or not, they were inferior to all white schools, but one potential explanation of this intriguing finding is that perhaps integrating schools in early life during a very tumultuous time in history would have been a stressor for African American children. I know we've all seen that picture of Ruby Bridges being escorted with the armed guards, So, that could have been a stressor in early life that we're able to measure in late life on these cognitive function tests. And, this finding is really consistent with other research that shows that early life stressors can have a negative impact on late life cognition, often through cardiovascular mechanisms. Now, another exposure that we've been very interested in is discrimination, an important stressor for diverse populations that's been linked to a number of adverse physical and mental health outcomes. We examined the association of discrimination with an inflammatory marker that you can measure in the blood called C-reactive protein. And we found a nice dose response pattern such that those participants who reported a higher frequency of discrimination, of experiencing discrimination, had more of this C-reactive protein in their blood, had more of this marker of inflammation than those who reported lower or fewer experiences of discrimination, suggesting a potential biologic response to their unfair treatment that we can measure in the blood. We then went on to look at the association of discrimination with performance on the cognitive function test. And we found that those who reported more discrimination performed more poorly overall on a global measure of our cognitive battery. And it seemed to be particularly bad for tests of memory and perceptual speed. And these are the two hallmark domains that are impaired in Alzheimer's disease. We've also shown a similar finding with another measure of perceived stress, called perceived stress. And this measure is supposed to capture the degree to which people find their lives unpredictable, uncontrollable, and overloading. One might think that this would be a very pervasive feeling or perception in minoritized populations. And so these data show that those who scored high on this scale, so at the 95th percentile, so they're responding that they have a lot of stress in their lives, they had a faster rate of cognitive decline compared to those who were reporting, lower levels of perceived stress. Again, indicating that or suggesting that perceptions of stress have an enduring effect on cognitive aging in older African Americans. But not to be all gloom and doom, we also look at protective factors. And, and one of the ones that I want to show is one that is so simple to measure. It's called life space, which is the spatial extent of movement within one's environment. And so here I'm showing you, we ask people, how often they go to these different zones in their environment. And then we correlate their answers with risk of Alzheimer's disease. We see, how that correlates with development of the disease and rate of decline over time. And what we find is that those people who report a higher life space, so they are going outside their neighborhood, they're going out of town, they have a reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease compared to those who have a more constricted life space. And they also have a slower rate of cognitive decline over time. So this is a protective factor that appears to operate in both African Americans and whites, and it's a very, very easy scale to administer. So my final poll for today, please indicate what true or false are contextual factors, things like discrimination and stress, related to the lived experience of African Americans. Are these important in understanding cognitive function in older adults? Please indicate whether that's a true statement or a false statement, based on what I've shown you, not based on what you think. I want to see what the answer is going to be, but I'm going to move on. It's a little delay here. 100%, yes. That means you totally buy what I'm selling you. No, you buy the data, so thank you. So in my last few minutes, what I want to do is to wrap up and just to quickly touch on another area that we are very interested in. As I told you, we're trying to get autopsies from our participants. And, we want to look at racial differences in the underlying pathology that causes Alzheimer's. And I'm not going to get into, technical details, but I think this is a really important concept for social work in particular to understand. So we know from studies of mostly whites, because that's where we have the brain tissue, that the accumulation of different abnormal proteins in the brain lead to Alzheimer's. You've probably heard about, amyloid and tau, plaques and tangles. That's always in the news, right? Those are the hallmark features of Alzheimer's. But we know from our autopsy studies that most people with Alzheimer's actually have a mixed pattern of abnormal proteins. So they don't just have amyloid and tau, they have infarcts from stroke, they have Lewy bodies, they have, vessel disease. It's a lot going on when somebody has dementia. It's not just the typical plaques and tangles that, that Dr. Alla's Alzheimer discovered in 1906. So, there's very little data on this issue in African Americans because of the lack of brain tissue in this population. So we looked at this question in one of our studies from our memory clinic. So when participants, they come to the clinic and, for medical care, we recruited them to our study. And we, when they died and came to autopsy, we examined the pathology in the brain. And we found a wide range of abnormal proteins in both African Americans and whites. But the interesting thing was that in African Americans, here's the type of pathology in their brain, they were much more likely to have mixed pathology here, shown with this red pie slice, compared to, look at the little sliver here for whites. Whites were much more likely to have the typical Alzheimer's, pathology. And when we looked at the African Americans, we thought for sure we were going to see a lot of vascular disease because of high rates of hypertension and high rates of diabetes. But we actually didn't see that. we saw a lot of abnormal protein called Lewy bodies. Now, Lewy bodies are associated with behavioral problems like hallucinations and sleep disorders. Remember, these are all people who presented to a memory clinic for medical care and then were recruited into our study. And so what it suggests is that when African Americans are presenting to a memory clinic, they may not be coming because of memory problems, but rather they may be coming for behavioral problems that may be particularly burdensome for caregivers. And if this is true, it has important implications for cognitive aging studies because it suggests a potential selection bias if you're only recruiting from a clinic for your studies. But it also gives clues about why people show up to medical care and the types of resources and medications that may be important for these families. So to conclude, I just want to summarize the 4 key takeaways that I think, I hope that you got from this presentation. The first one is that this increased risk of Alzheimer's among African Americans that we hear so much about seems to be due to a persistent racial difference in where people start on these cognitive tests. The cognitive tests are how we diagnose the disease, and they're already starting out lower. And so we have to figure out or incorporate longitudinal studies to complement these cross-sectional studies so we can get a better picture of how people are changing over time and relate these different risk factors to their trajectories of change. The second key point is that we need to increase the diverse populations in Alzheimer's studies in general, because what we're finding is that the risk factors and the drivers of disease may be different across these populations. And, related to that, social determinants and variables that reflect the lived experience are turning out to be very helpful in understanding where people start out in their cognitive function. And the third point is, I know that you all are aware as a School of Social Work, but the importance of taking a multidisciplinary approach and really working in team science, cannot be overstated. The value that I have gotten out of working with social workers in my studies is just, it's amazing. And it's something that I, would love for other clinical research studies to incorporate. And then finally, we need studies with biologic outcomes in diverse populations because, and if we just stop where we are, and, we're only going to be looking at descriptive studies that show that we have a disparity. We already know we have a disparity. We now have to understand why we have a disparity. And so we need studies that have biologic mechanisms incorporated into their studies. Either if it's not autopsy, it needs to be, blood donation, or it needs to be PET imaging, or something so that we can see what's going on in the body that relates to this disease. So, we don't have very many students, but I was going to share that our data are freely available at this research resource sharing hub. And, we have tons and tons of data, and we freely give out data for students who want to work on dissertations or faculty who want to, work on grants or papers. And I'm always happy to collaborate with people. I want to thank the funding agencies and the participants of our work who are just so altruistic and have been with us for more than 20 years. And, this is not something that I can do alone. I want to really acknowledge the faculty at Rush and all of our partners across the US who we work with on these important studies. So I will stop there and stop sharing my screen so that we can take questions. Thank you for your attention.
Wow, Dr. Barnes, thank you very much. That was spectacular. I have a few questions, and some more research and some a bit more straightforward. So, number one, are people still being accepted into your study?
Yes, people are accepted. It's a ongoing rolling admission, but you have to live in Chicago. I have not yet incorporated people in other states. I do have people who moved from Chicago, and we are following them still, but you have to start out in Chicago right now.
Okay, thank you. And your work that looks at discrimination, um, have you found any differences in terms of what people call everyday discrimination, which is sort of being treated unfairly on a day-to-day basis versus major discrimination, which is things like being fired unfairly or not being able to rent an apartment that you would like?
Right. That's a great question. We actually we don't use the major discrimination scale. So I didn't tell you, but the scale that we're using is the David Williams Everyday Discrimination Scale, where we're looking at these more minor or unfair treatment, but we don't look at major. And that was primarily because we were one of the first groups to really hone in on older adults, and we found that a lot of those major instances were not that frequent. Like people were not reporting that those things happen. These African Americans are retired. They're living it in their own neighborhoods or whatever, and so the unfair treatment was much more common. And so I would be happy to incorporate that, but I just don't think we would get much with it right now.
Yeah, yeah. And is nutrition a factor in the types of studies that you're doing?
That's a really great question. Nutrition is absolutely a factor. We have other studies where we have, measured nutrition, what people eat and related it to risk of disease and cognitive decline. I don't measure that in my own cohort yet, but I have a new faculty member who just joined Rush, and she's interested in incorporating nutrition into my study. So I anticipate that I will have those data very soon, because that's obviously a really key component in aging.
And I noticed that you mentioned that you didn't have a lot of students involved at this point. Have you ever worked with MSW students in terms of recruitment or anything like that? Again, as part of a school of social work.
Yeah. No, the social worker that we hired, she started out as a student, an intern, and then once she got her MSW, she's started working as a social worker. But we don't have a school of social work in Chicago, and so we haven't. There is one at UFC, and so that would definitely be a resource for us. But like I said, we weren't even really in tune with the need for a social worker until we were 10 years into the study, and people were presenting with all these issues, that was interfering with them, scheduling their appointments. So we were like, we need to figure out how to help people so that they'll stay in the study. And that's when we discovered social work.
Yeah. So a few other questions. So people more recently have been doing work on social isolation as a risk factor for various things. And also people do work on social support, which is sort of the opposite, as a protective factor. So have you done any work, and have you found either of those to be consistent predictors or protective or risk factors?
Yes, we have looked at that in our Chicago Health and Aging Project in the population study, and we did find that that people who reported more social networks had a protective effect, so they were less likely to decline over time. In our studies of whites, we have found that social isolation is actually a risk factor for Alzheimer's. So people who report being more socially isolated are more at risk. I haven't yet looked at that in our diverse population, but that's definitely something that I want to look at in the future.
We have a sort of a general question, but are there any exclusion issues or exclusion criteria for being participant in your study, like if you have serious mental health problems, as an example?
Yeah. So, the beauty of our study is that we really, try to embrace aging and its complexity. So we take all comers. The only thing that we exclude is dementia, because we want to be able to understand what causes it. So you just cannot have, a dementia diagnosis. Now, it turns out that about maybe about 4% of people who enroll actually have dementia and didn't know it because they never went to the doctor. But we don't take people who, come and say, I was told I have dementia, or I'm taking, Aricept or Namenda. We try to keep, that group of people out so that we can look at the risk factors. But everything else, mental illness, cancer, diabetes, we take it all, and then we just adjust for it in our analyses.
I have, again, a few more questions here. So how about, do you know if any of the work that you've been doing has been able to influence treatment?
Oh, good question. No, not yet. Unfortunately, we don't have really great treatments. All the treatment trials have essentially failed for this disease. It's a really frustrating, disease because we're not hitting the right target, or, not at the right time. And so, it's my hope though that people will start taking notice of some of these findings, because what it's showing us is that we might need to take a more of a precision medicine approach, right? And really understand the context in which people are living. Because I think that's going to have an effect on treatment, but, it takes many studies and many of these findings to be replicated before they really start to affect the treatment world. But that's what we're trying to do, right? Trying to understand how we can better identify these targets based on the context of people's lives.
So here's a few other questions. So one, have you found any gender differences? And the second one, related to that, have you studied any urban and rural differences? Are there any research on urban and rural differences among African Americans?
Well, that's a great question. So the gender differences one, I am very interested in gender differences, and I have not really explored that yet in my studies. And the reason is because, it's really predominantly women right now. I have tried to go to all kinds of places to get men. And, the men that I get are husbands of the wives. I've gone to firemen and policemen, and, it's hard to get them to volunteer. So it's sort of, challenging to look at gender differences when you're predominantly women, but it's definitely something that I'm interested in. The other question about urban versus rural, I think there are studies out there. Chicago is, similar to Detroit. It's an urban area. So I don't have that type of variability across geography in my study. There's definitely this huge study called Regards that is, a population-based study of African Americans and whites, primarily in the southern part of the country. And I think that they have an urban versus rural component to their study.
How about any religion influences? Does it matter or not?
I'm sure it does. Your work has shown that it's vitally important. We do have a spirituality scale, and we ask about religious attendance. And we have not really looked at those yet. We think we need a bit more power to see if those are working. But, I'm interested in resilience factors, right? And so that is why I added those, because I don't want to just focus on the things that are bad for us. I want to see what are some of those resilience markers that are protecting people over time. And so I'm hopeful that we'll start to see something with spirituality and religiosity.
Okay. So here's a sort of specific question. And it says that you mentioned the APOE4 gene.
Yeah.
You're saying that correctly?
Yeah.
Is that gene more common among African Americans?
Yeah, I had it on the slide, but I didn't talk about it. But we are interested in it because the APOE gene is the most robust genetic risk factor, the most well-established risk factor for Alzheimer's in whites. And although African Americans are much more likely to have the E4 part of that gene, it does not seem to be having the same level of risk in disease. And so we've been really interested in understanding, what is it about this gene that might be different? Why do African Americans have so much of it? We know that it carries cholesterol. So that's, it's the ApoE gene I'm talking about. It carries cholesterol, and, African Americans have high levels of cholesterol. But it doesn't seem to be affecting Alzheimer's disease in the same way as in whites. And so we have a study that was just published that is looking at genes that surround ApoE. So there's something called TOM40, and we're finding that Black African Americans who have, this TOM40 and ApoE interaction, they have a different risk of this disease than whites. And so, and it's because of admixture, right? Because most African Americans who came from Africa ended up, admixing, if that's a word, with the white population. And so you have a lot of this genetic mixture going on in African Americans. And so it's probably explaining why we're not getting a clear picture with the ApoE gene, but a lot more needs to be done in that area.
Thank you. So I have a comment and then maybe two more questions, and then we'll conclude. So one is that this is the comment. It seems that contextual factors are key. As modifiable factors, they point to things such as nutrition, social support, social networks, physical activity, and generally the same things that improve your cardiovascular and other health also includes your cognitive health. So again, it's sort of I think it's pretty straightforward. So we'll just leave that as a comment. In terms of the work that you've done and other people have done, have people seen any different, in health research, there's this thing called the immigrant paradox. Sometimes you hear the Latino paradox, which is that more recent immigrants that have come from poor countries have better health in the United States. Do we see that with cognitive health?
I think we do see that with cognitive health with Latinos. And it's a question about, though, whether it's really the people who are healthier and better off who are able to immigrate to the country. So we need to be able to understand and disentangle that a little bit more.
Yeah. And let's see. How much does social learning theory, does it play a role in the analysis of cognitive assessments data?
What is social learning theory? I'm sorry.
That is a great question. And so I'm not a psychologist, so I know I've heard the term over and over and over, but.
I'm a psychologist, but I'm a neuropsychologist. So,
so here, let me see if there's any other thing. Do you know of any work, and this may be related to what you do, but it may not, that deals with unconscious bias? Again, deals with discrimination in terms of work with African Americans with Alzheimer's.
Oh yeah, so not with Alzheimer's as much, but there's this concept of stereotype threat from Claude Steele championed, where it's been done mostly, though, I think with younger and people in school maybe, where you invoke the negative stereotype, say like underperformance, and when you give someone a test, they actually perform more poorly when that stereotype is invoked. I know that's been done in college age students and and people working. I haven't seen that done as much in Alzheimer's research. I think that would be fascinating to look at that and see and sort of corroborate some of the discrimination findings we're getting.
And I guess the last point is what you started off with, which is recruitment. So to what degree are studies of Alzheimer's biased when they're only recruiting from clinical settings?
Our data suggests that there is a huge bias, because we know that African Americans have a complicated relationship with the healthcare system, right? And so many African Americans don't engage with the healthcare system. And, so you're getting a select group of people to begin with, people who have a relationship. And then we found, at least with the memory clinic results, that, people, when they died, we saw that their pathology was more related to hallucinations and behavioral problems, suggesting that, that maybe people are showing up to a memory clinic because of these issues. Like mom is hallucinating, or mom is running down the street with no clothes on. That's a problem. But if mom has a memory problem, oh, she's just old. That's just grandma. She's just, forgetting. And so we ignore that, right? And so there's another selection bias in the clinic for that regard. And I think that might be true across the board. I think we have to just really critically think about who's in our sample when we're doing this research and what kinds of conclusions can we draw. I mean, even with my own research, it's not bias free because I'm getting volunteers, and we know that volunteers tend to be healthier. They tend to, be, more concerned with their health. So we try to replicate our results in population-based studies, and that really gives us confidence in the findings when we're able to do that.
Well, Dr. Barnes, thank you very much. I truly have appreciated this hour with you. I have one thing to mention for everybody. So again, this is just a reminder. In order to receive CEs for today's webinar, you need to stay for the duration of time, respond to the poll questions, and also attend the presentation tomorrow, which is at the same time. Again, I want to thank you for Dr. Barnes for, again, an outstanding presentation. And if you're interested in Dr. Barnes's research, it's available. She has, again, over 200 articles, and I've read, Alzheimer's is not my area, but I've been reading up just for this presentation, and I've really enjoyed it. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you all.